Hi, Mark from Enchantment of Eternity here, and I wasn't planning on doing this video, but I kind of wanted to address the fallout of Episode 5 of Season 8 of Game of Thrones, titled The Bells, because it's been an incredibly divisive episode. Now, having a divisive fan base is nothing new to many popular entertainment franchises, be it Star Wars, Star Trek, The Walking Dead, Doctor Who, or what have you. In fact, it's getting all too familiar. However, I feel that everyone is entitled to their own opinion, and in most cases, I would say it's the creator of these pieces that are mostly responsible for this division rather than the fan base itself. And I say that even about controversial pieces that I personally liked, such as The Last Jedi and Star Trek Discovery, so I'm not making a judgment call here on those who do or do not like these franchises. But with Game of Thrones, I've actually been on both sides of the argument here, as there was a sizable chunk of the fan base who didn't like the direction the show was going in, arguably ever since Season 5. And during Seasons 5 and 6, and even for the first 4 episodes of Season 7, I staunchly defended the show and disagreed with those who felt the show had completely lost quality. In fact, I would still to this day staunchly defend those seasons. But my opinion changed in the last 3 episodes of Season 7, which to me personally was a massive disappointment and completely failed to live up to the high standard of the character-based complex storytelling that Game of Thrones was known for, and ditched it instead for a pace that seemed incredibly rushing towards the ending, and tossing aside all logic and character building that the show had been doing for 7 years. So, when Season 8 was about to air, I was very dubious, but decided to be open-minded and to give the show a chance. In fact, I found I enjoyed the first 3 episodes, but after these past 2 episodes, 4 and 5, I have retrospectively came to the conclusion that the whole season is a failure, and has succumbed to the same terribly rushed drop in quality in storytelling that also plagued Season 7. Now, this conclusion was in no small part based on the latest episode to air, the penultimate episode of the entire show, titled The Bells, which I would personally count as one of the worst, if not the worst, episode of the show that they have ever done, at least in terms of storytelling. In terms of production value, things like cinematography, acting, editing, music, directing, art directing, special effects, it was nearly a masterpiece and achieved an extremely high quality, and that I won't deny. But in terms of writing, storytelling, character-based stories that are consistent with what came before and that are satisfying conclusions to the story we've been following for 8+ years, this episode was an utter failure. And unfortunately, writing and storytelling is at the heart of any story, be it TV show or otherwise. And without a strong story, the rest of the high quality production value doesn't matter. It's just basically hollow pretty pictures with nothing at the base of it holding it up. However, I do respect the opinions of those who don't agree with me and did like this episode and did feel that it was a satisfying conclusion. I personally would disagree with that conclusion, but I have always been a strong proponent that everyone is entitled to their own opinions. However, such is typical whenever a fan base is divided like this. Often you see vitriol coming from both sides aimed at those who don't share their own opinions. And in this video in particular, I would like to address some of that vitriol that's being thrown at those such as myself who did not care for the latest episode of Game of Thrones, nor the Season 8 as a whole. More specifically, I would like to address the Strawmans. So, just to be clear, what I mean when I say strawman, I'm going to read the definition of a strawman argument as described by Wikipedia. So, Wikipedia describes a strawman argument as a form of argument and an informal fallacy based on giving the impression of refuting an opponent's argument while actually refuting an argument that was not presented by that opponent. One who engages in this fallacy is said to be attacking a strawman. The typical strawman argument creates the illusion of having completely refuted or defeated an opponent's proposition through the covert replacement of it with a different proposition, i.e. stand up a strawman, and the subsequent refutation of that false argument knock down a strawman instead of the opponent's proposition. So there are 3 specific strawman arguments I've seen on multiple sources throughout the internet, be it articles, blogs, YouTube videos, user reviews, comments, and whatnot. They all seem to use these strawman arguments to attack and or discredit and dismiss those like myself who did not care for the Bells or Season 8 of Game of Thrones as a whole. Now, I must make it clear these sentiments I've seen are not just coming from quote-unquote internet trolls, because I agree with the adage that the trolls are best ignored, but rather they seem quite common amongst those who enjoyed the latest episode, so I felt a need to address them. When addressing each strawman, I will quote specific user reviews on IMDb to clarify I'm not just making up this position. But to be clear, I don't just see these sentiments on IMDb user reviews, but I see them in multiple sources throughout social media wherever opinions are expressed. I'm just using these quotes as an example. They are not limited to this source. And I won't be citing the usernames of those who made these quotes, as I don't feel it's necessary for me to call them out, or I don't want them to feel like I'm attacking any individual specifically. However, if you'd like to see these quotes in full context, you can simply check out the IMDb user reviews for episode 5 of season 8 of Game of Thrones, The Bell. But I assure you, I did not take these quotes out of context, and the context of the whole review fits the sentiments of the quotes in question. So the first straw man I'd like to address is, you just wanted a happy ending. GOT is not going to have a fairy tale ending. We all knew this. Just enjoy the show and stop complaining that it isn't going to turn out how you always imagined it would. There was never going to be a happy ending. Get over yourselves. This is war. If you want happy endings, go see a Disney movie. And there was also a massive amount of people quoting Ramsay's line, "If you thought this would be a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention." In fact, some people put that quote as their entire review. So, this straw man argument, because myself and the majority of others who did not like the Bells did not in fact want a happy ending. Speaking solely for myself, I had specifically said that if the show had a happy or fairy tale ending, I would be sorely disappointed and consider the show a failure, and I know many who share my view and opinions who agree with that. In fact, I had not personally seen anyone express the opinion that they are disappointed because they expected the show to have a happy ending. This straw man is used to dismiss and ignore the actual argument being made about the Bells, that is, it was rushed writing that's inconsistent with the characters, and the conclusions that happened to so many of the characters we've been following for years did not feel earned, and so the whole episode felt hollow. Again, speaking for myself, whether or not the events that occurred in the Bells were happy or not couldn't be more beside the point. In fact, in previous weeks when I talked about in vague terms what I wanted to go down in this episode, I was hoping for a bittersweet or shocking events that in no way, shape, or form would be happy. What I wanted, however, was something that felt true to the characters and felt like a natural conclusion to many of the storylines I've been following for years. Instead, what we got was, in my opinion, a hastily thrown together episode where not a single solitary character who appeared in this episode was behaving true to their character traits as portrayed earlier in the show. Instead, they were behaving in ways that were conducive to pushing the plot in the direction that the writers want to go, or appeasing fans through quote-unquote fan service. So now let's get into the second straw man number 2. You just wanted Daenerys to be the hero. Those who say Dany suddenly got dark, please pay more attention and watch the previous seasons. Everybody who thought Dany would have been the hero of this story did not properly watch the previous seasons. She burned countless innocent people, Sam's family, before and had no trouble crucifying people. It's good writing, but it hurts people who love Dany. Just because she appeared to be a solid hero does not mean she is incapable of succumbing to a mental breakdown caused by the loss of everything that she loves near and dear to her. Now, again, I never saw the opinion of anyone who thought Daenerys would be the ultimate hero of the show and wanted her to get a fairy tale ending where she ruled over Westeros as the rightful and benevolent queen. I mean, I'm sure if you scoured the internet, you could find a few people who felt that way. I never felt that way, nor do I know anyone who did. This fails to take into account the nuance of what those who didn't like the show are saying about how Daenerys behaved in this episode was out of character for her. We're not saying we wanted her to be the hero or that it is out of character for her to be to do anything selfish or out of anger, but this argument tends to look at our perspective as binary, that she's either good or she's evil. Those are your only two options, and ignores that there's actually a spectrum, and ignores all nuance, and that, in fact, many of us wanted and or expected to see Daenerys on that spectrum towards the end of doing things that would be considered evil or acting irrationally or out of anger or selfishness, desire to rule, but we expected those actions to stay true to her character in the way that she's been portrayed for 8+ seasons. Yes, there's always been a dark side to Daenerys, who often burns her enemies in dragonfire in the most brutal ways, and sometimes when she does, it's debatable on whether or not it's justified or whether or not it's morally correct. And she has always had this dark side and lust for power. But I personally feel that many who would argue that this behavior was totally in her character are forgetting all the other character traits. For every scene I often hear cited or dialogue I hear quoted that would indicate that Daenerys has a dark side, there's an equal number of scenes and quotes that would indicate that mass murdering civilians is completely and utterly out of character for her. So let's look at some of the nasty things she's done. So first, betraying and murdering all the masters of Astapor. This was done out of a desire to help civilians, as she saw entire people were being oppressed, enslaved, mutilated, and killed. As the masters of Astapor mutilated the Unsullied and forced them to kill babies, and those who disobeyed the very tiniest of offenses would be treated to the most torturous and gruesome death. And so Daenerys killed the masters of Astapor in order to stop this cycle from occurring, in order to protect the civilian population. And then she had the opportunity to return to Westeros, to reclaim her throne, like her advisors wanted her to do. And if she was really power hungry, and if she was really obsessed with gaining the throne, she would have done this. But instead, she stayed in Slaver's Bay, not to gain more troops, as Yunkai and Meereen didn't offer more fighting forces, but to destroy the slave trade, because she wanted to act to protect the people, to stop murder, torture, rape, and enslavement of a civilian population. And she stayed in Meereen even after acquiring a fleet of ships. Why? Because if she left, she knew Slaver's Bay would fall back into slavery, and she did not want that to happen. She did horribly crucify a group of masters. She did this because they crucified an equal amount of children just to taunt her. But the slavers may or may not have been involved in that. In fact, we later learned that one of the men she crucified spoke out against crucifying the children. So this is the perfect shade of gray that's open to interpretation. Was this justified? Her intentions were good, but did she go too far? And when a terrorist group called the Sons of the Harpy, whose goal was to overthrow Daenerys, formed, she tried to treat them fairly. She refused to execute a man who likely murdered members of her own troops, instead demanding a fair trial. But when the Sons of the Harpy executed a massive attack that claimed the life of her then closest advisor, Barristan Selmy, she again does something a bit sketchy as she gathers the heads of all the noble houses in Meereen who may or may not have been involved in the Sons of the Harpy and burns one of them alive at random. So again, one could argue that this wasn't justified and that it was cruel, but it's open to debate because her intentions were good. Her intentions were still to protect the people against slavery, and she just suffered an attack, a loss of someone close to her. And later she returns to Meereen when it is under siege from the slavers, and her first instinct was to destroy the slavers and burn their cities to the ground. And this is one of those quotes I'm hearing cited back to me a lot after the bells aired. So let's look at this one. So Tyrion does talk her out of it, and instead she gets a decisive victory on the slaver and makes an example out of them by killing 2 out of 3 of their leaders, but leaving the other one left alive to make it clear that the slavery is done, which is in fact very effective. So she was able to prevail by not killing innocent civilians. But one would argue that it was only happened this way because Tyrion talked her out of it, that her first instinct was to kill a bunch of civilians. So let's, for the sake of argument, say that Tyrion wasn't there to talk her out of it, or that she just didn't listen to him, and that she did in fact burn the cities of Yunkai, Astapor, and Volantis to the ground, killing thousands of innocent civilians. That, no doubt, could be justified as being the Mad Queen, and it could be seen as a cruel and evil act, but it would be, it would be provocated and done in the name of protecting the former slaves of Slaver's Bay. So, it would be something more along the lines of the story that we wanted for Season 8, something that's still in her character, but morally questionable. However, as I said, if she did burn those cities to the ground, it would be in the name of protecting people, not killing them. And when she does come to Westeros, she does, has the review I quoted pointed out, roast Randall and Dickon Tarly alive. However, they were not innocent people, as the quote suggests. They defied her, they attacked her, and then once they were captured, they refused to bend the knee to her, even after they lost. Now, let's compare that to the person who is now being portrayed as the bastion of good and the counter to Daenerys' evil. Jon Snow, what an honorable man. So, in Season 5, Janos Slynt defied his orders and Jon had him executed by his own hands. And I would argue the main difference between these two instances is that Janos Slynt repented and begged for his life, promising to obey Jon if he spared him. Whereas Randall and Dickon remained defiant up until the very end, refusing to give 1 inch to Daenerys. So, by that standard, I would make the argument that Jon was more cruel, he was more mad than Dany in this execution, and that, in fact, this is a simple fact that any lord in Westeros has to deal with. And any lord would have reacted the same way as Daenerys, even those who are seen in the show as a bastion of good, like Jon, or even like Ned Stark. So, using this as an example on how Daenerys went mad does not at all work. Now, let's get into Season 8, where Daenerys put her own lust for power aside to face the greater threat of the White Walkers, to save humanity, to look after the small folk. She gave nearly half of her forces, including her closest friend and advisor Jorah, to this cause, and in order to work together in fellowship with the armies of the North in the Vale and the Free Folk. And this experience has seemed to have exactly 0 effect on her character. Now, a lot of people argue that she just lost her closest friend Jorah, and shortly after, Cersei's forces kills one of her dragons, and who she views as her children, and then Cersei's forces brutally executes another one of her closest friends and advisors, Missandei, and she does it just to torment her. And her relationship with Jon is falling apart as she fears many would betray her, trying to put Jon on the throne like Varys, whom betrays her and she has brutally killed. But all of that I do buy would make her angry and act irrationally and do something many might consider morally unjustified or evil, such as killing hundreds of civilians in order to defeat Cersei and punish her for what she did in order to get revenge on Cersei for killing one of her children and one of her closest friends. But that's not what she did. Cersei's forces had surrendered. She had won. There was absolutely zero reason for her to kill civilians. If she wanted to kill Cersei to punish her for killing her dragon in Missandei, she could have simply flown straight to the Red Keep, and burned Cersei alive. Sure, some innocent civilians would have died, so it would have been completely justified, and some could have made the case that she was acting a bit mad, and it was a bit evil of her, but Cersei had wronged her, and she wanted revenge. But instead of attacking Cersei, she goes straight for the civilian population who had done absolutely nothing. Zero to her, and makes absolutely no sense. There is simply no justification for this. It goes totally against her characters of 7 years of established backstory of wanting to help civilians, of wanting to free the populace from tyranny. And the excuses that I've heard to explain this away, included those from the showrunners themselves, Dan and Dave, are beyond weak. Such as when they said, she looked on King's Landing as a symbol of what they did to her family and what her family has lost. As I just went through, her character journey has not been about holding a grudge and wanting to kill everyone who overthrew her family. If so, she could have killed Jaime, the very man who killed her father, and she had another opportunity to do so in this very episode, but she didn't. Also, if that was her story arc was all about, then she would have left Meereen. In fact, she would never even went to Meereen. She would have went straight to Westeros to reclaim the Iron Throne and punish those who wronged her family. But she didn't. Why? Well, it wasn't to make her forces stronger. If anything, staying in Meereen, where she was under constant terrorist attack, weakened her forces, didn't strengthen them. So no, that's not why she stayed. She stayed to help the populace there, to protect the population. Every time she threatened to burn people alive or crucified them, it was in the service of protecting her people. And for her to turn directly to the people who in fact hated Cersei, while ignoring Cersei, the one person who did in fact wrong her, makes zero sense. I don't care how alone she felt. I don't care how angry she felt. I don't care how irrational she was. I don't care what happened to her family. Being angry doesn't turn someone into a mass murderer who completely ignores the one person who wrongs her and instead murders a civilian population that did absolutely nothing to her. Now, does this mean I wanted her to be a hero? No. It means I wanted her to stay in character. I wouldn't mind if she did a lot of morally questionable things or murder a lot of innocents. In fact, I kind of wanted it. But it needed to be earned. It needed to make sense for her character. There needed to be a reason for it to make sense for her character up to this point. The people needed to have wronged her, or she would have needed to get those that wronged her and the people were simply in her way. Or they were actively fighting against her. That would have been justified for her character. It would have made sense. To slaughter hundreds of people who were just going about their lives while ignoring the one woman who did kill her dragon, her child, and her best friend makes no sense. No sense whatsoever. You can scream Mad Queen all you want, but her character was never portrayed to have that kind of irrational madness before this episode. Just bouts of anger and irrationality aimed at those who wronged her or those who threatened innocent civilians. And I'm not saying they couldn't have done this. They could have. But they would have needed a hell of a lot more groundwork and character building to justify such a drastic change in character. And that goes back to the core problem with Season 8, that it was rushed. And the way that the characters were behaving was not at all earned. Now let me get to the third straw man. You're just unhappy because your theory didn't come true. And it's rated 7 because many people don't get over the fact that things weren't exactly the way they wanted, or because their favorite character didn't win. People are crying because it isn't ending the way they wanted it to. People spent years making theories and building up high expectations, which led to not accepting any ending for the show. Get over it. Fans are ripping this episode apart because the show is not ending the way they wanted it to end, yet the show, the conclusion of the show looks very promising. And this next quote was the actual title for the review. Great episode. People are just mad their predictions didn't come true. Now, so I feel I can talk on this subject with some authority, considering I put out several theory videos predicting how Game of Thrones would end. In fact, these videos are clearly responsible for my channel receiving as much attention as it does, and these theory videos on how Game of Thrones will end are still the most viewed videos on my channel. So am I just upset that my theories didn't come true? Well, a lot of them did. At the end of Season 4, before Season 5 aired, I made a prediction that Arya would go to the House of Black and White and train to become a Faceless Man, and then become an expert assassin, but then leave the Faceless Man and go to Westeros to kill people on her kill list for her own purposes, and she would start by killing Walder Frey. And then later I refined this theory to say that she would go to King's Landing to kill Cersei, but not actually kill her. I also said that Tyrion, Jon, and Daenerys would be revealed to be Targaryens, and they would all ride dragons to fight the White Walkers. Now, I was only half right about that one, because I was wrong about Tyrion, but I was right about Jon and Daenerys riding dragons to fight the White Walkers. And the two main theories I had about who would sit on the Iron Throne were that it would either be Sansa or that it would be no one, because there would be no more Iron Throne. And both of those theories are still possible. So, if one of those theories were to come true, would I then turn around and go, oh, the show's great now because my theories are true? Well, the answer to that is no. Because in actuality, it's not about whether or not my theories come true. It's about whether or not the show is any good. And in my opinion, the show has already ruined the ending, regardless if any of my theories comes true or not. So it's quite irrelevant. And besides which, I made those theories as a bit of fun. I said every time I made a theory video that I'd be surprised if any of my theories came true, so I'm frankly still in shock that my Arya theory was so accurate. But here's the reality. I actually hope my theories don't come true, because I want the writers to do better than me. I'm not a professional writer, they are. So I prefer they surprise me and come up with something better than what I came up with. This is true of Season 6, where I did a series of Season 6 prediction videos, most of these predictions were wrong, and the majority of the predictions I got wrong, I was very happy to get wrong, because the show did something better than what I came up with, and it surprised me by showing what good writers they are and how they understand their own show better than I do, which they should. So I don't think anyone is upset that their theories didn't come true. They're just upset that what they actually happened in the show was worse than their fan theories. Because when average Joes on the internet can come up with better endings than the actual professional writers who should know their own show, then something is wrong. And those who don't like the show tell you outright why. They describe the poor, rushed writing and how the story is now all about plot rather than the characters as it has been in the past, and that none of the character development has been in keeping with the characters. So for someone to completely ignore what people are actually saying and instead to come up with a straw man about theories not coming true is not only asinine, but it's also a clear sign that these people don't want to hear the real reason why people didn't like the show. They just want to make up their own reasons so they can bash them. In fact, I would turn this around and say that some of those who had the theory that Daenerys would go mad seemed to be all up themselves that their theory was correct and blind to the poorly way in which it was written and accomplished in the show. But, that's just my opinion. Again, not only would I not mind if I was wrong about Daenerys going mad, but I would in fact love it if it was done in a good, believable way. But it wasn't, and that is the real issue, not whether or not my theory was correct. Now, I said there were 3 strawmans, but there's another argument I've seen, and it's not necessarily a straw man, but it is an incorrect argument aimed at those dissatisfied with the show. This one I have seen tossed around ever since the end of season 7, and for this one, I'm not going to cite quotes from IMDb, but I'm going to show a meme that I saw circulating after the bells aired. And that is the argument that it's just a fantasy show. Don't take it so seriously. And I'll show the meme and give you a few seconds to read it. Again, it's not just this meme. This is a sentiment I've seen expressed by professional critics, commenters, YouTubers, and throughout social media ever since the end of season 7. But let me address this meme real quick. First of all, this is the world's most inaccurate meme because it shows George R.R. Martin and not Dan and Dave. No one is complaining about George R.R. Martin's writing. They're complaining about Dan and Dave's horrible writing. And ironically, it's actually pretty evident from recent interviews with George R.R. Martin, despite the fact that he's contractually obligated to say otherwise, that he's also extremely unhappy with how Dan and Dave are writing the ending of Game of Thrones. But, leaving that aside and focusing more on the sentiment behind the meme, this seems very illogical to me, because the sentiment here seems to be, because that is fantasy, we're not supposed to take it seriously. I wonder if those using this logic would apply it to all fiction, like movies like The Shawshank Redemption or 12 Years a Slave or Good Will Hunting or Rain Man, because I'm pretty sure most people take those movies seriously. Or is it just because it's a fantasy genre, and that somehow discredits it and makes it, more that people aren't meant to take it seriously as those other films because dragons are involved? That is, in fact, an argument that I've heard, that because dragons and White Walkers are involved, that means that all logical thought and arguments are invalid. But this, of course, fails to understand the basic inner workings of fantasy. That as a genre, a fantasy story needs to establish its own rules on how reality works and then stick to them. It's not a no-holds-bar against all rules of reality simply because some mythical creatures exist in that reality. For example, dragons exist because they were established from the very beginning that they do exist in this universe. It was never established, however, that ravens and people can move vast distances in an absurdly short amount of time, and the fact that dragons exist doesn't make this or any of the other logical rules of reality null and void. I mean, that's basic storytelling 101. I was completely flabbergasted that trained and educated critics could not grasp this very basic, very simple concept. in my humble opinion, this made any credentials that they had to critique fiction invalid. But getting back to the bells. Well, the argument here seems to be, well, don't take this too seriously. So, does this episode, or any episode of Game of Thrones for that matter, strike you as the type of story that you're not supposed to take seriously? I mean, those type of stories do exist, the ones you're not supposed to take seriously, in things like comedies or children's stories. But does an episode with hundreds of innocent people dying and being burned alive in the most brutal way possible, and the way that is shot and the music and everything about the framing of the scene is obviously done in such a way to make the viewer feel something about this, to feel the weight of this brutality. Does that at all come off as silly or comical to you? Because it doesn't to me. To me, it's beyond clear that the whole structure of this episode is meant to be taken seriously. So, I have no idea where the, oh, you're taking this too seriously argument comes from. And clearly, the episode is in fact designed in such a way to be taken seriously. Now, the other argument is, well, what is meant by people are taking the show too seriously is that people shouldn't get so worked up over a work of fiction, and it's just sit back and enjoy it. So, before I made this video, I specifically decided not to bash or to say anything insulting to those who did not like this episode. As I said at the top of my video, I feel everyone is entitled to their opinion, so that's why I decided not to say that the only way to enjoy this episode is to turn your brain off and to not think too much about it, because saying that sounds a little insulting. But I'm not saying it, they're saying it, because that is basically what the don't take this too seriously argument boils down to. Turn off your brain. Don't think too much about it. It's just a TV show. Just sit back and enjoy. And I'm saying, if that's how you think Game of Thrones should be watched, then you have missed the whole point of the entire show. Ever since season 1, the show has purposely been complex and provocative, not only to entertain, but to make the audience think. To immerse the audience in this fictional world, while at the same time making commentary on how this relates to our own world and how it relates to our lives and the human condition. And I would argue that that is a hallmark of any good fantasy or science fiction, and it most certainly is one of the main reasons why this show became as successful and as popular and as beloved as it is. So to suggest that after 6.5 seasons of the show was all about making people think, and it was all about being complex, and that's how it gained its popularity, that's how it gained its accolades of these complexities and these intricacies, that now all of a sudden we are meant to turn our brains off and just enjoy. I'm sorry, but if that is in fact the case, and frankly it seems like it is, then the problem isn't with the audience who views it, it's with the writers who create it. Anyway, that's all I have to say about this topic. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, please be sure to check out my channel for more content, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and thank you so much for watching.